The rain hammered against Helen Foster's apartment window in Portland, Oregon, each drop echoing the emptiness she felt in her chest. At 29, she had reached the end of her rope. The eviction notice sat crumpled on her kitchen counter next to a stack of rejection letters from job interviews that had led nowhere. Her savings account showed $47.82, and her phone had been buzzing with calls from debt collectors all morning. But what hurt most wasn't the financial ruin. It was the silence from heaven. Helen pulled out a small, worn diary, the same one she'd written in as a child when she believed God heard every whisper of her heart. Her fingers trembled as she opened to a blank page, the smell of old paper mixing with her tears. This would be her last prayer, her final plea to a universe that seemed to have forgotten her name. "If heaven exists," she wrote in shaky handwriting, "prove it. Give me a sign today, because I can't keep believing in something that doesn't believe in me." She slammed the diary shut and threw it across the room, watching it hit the wall and fall to the floor with a soft thud. Outside, thunder rolled across the Portland skyline, like a cosmic laugh at her desperation. What Helen didn't know was that this moment, this breaking point where faith meets despair, was exactly when the impossible becomes inevitable. If you're someone who understands that miracles often disguise themselves as coincidences, and that divine intervention rarely looks like what we expect, then what happened to Helen next will challenge everything you thought you knew about how heaven communicates with earth. Because sometimes, the answer to our prayers doesn't come from above. Sometimes it comes from within, wearing the face we forgot we used to have. Helen had no idea that in exactly 12 hours, she would open her bedroom door to find a 7-year-old girl sitting on her bed. A girl with her own eyes, her own smile, wearing the exact yellow dress from her favorite childhood photograph. A girl who would speak words that would either save Helen's soul or convince her she had finally lost her mind. "I'm you," the child would say, before the hurt. "Heaven never forgot you. You forgot how to believe." But the documented events that followed would prove that when we stop listening for God's voice in the thunder, we might finally hear it in the whisper of our own forgotten innocence. This is Helen's story, verified by medical records, witnessed by neighbors, and recorded in a diary that now contains handwriting from 2 different versions of the same soul. What you're about to witness is the kind of miracle that doesn't make headlines because it's too intimate, too personal, too impossible for most people to accept. But for those who know that reality is far more magical than we've been taught, Helen's encounter will remind you why some prayers are answered not with what we want, but with who we used to be. Helen Foster's alarm clock buzzed at 6:30 a.m., cutting through the gray Portland morning like a knife. She rolled over in her Murphy bed, feeling the familiar weight of dread settle into her stomach before her eyes even opened. The eviction notice on her kitchen counter seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy, even from across her tiny studio apartment. She had built her life carefully, methodically, a degree in graphic design from Portland State, 5 years at a boutique marketing agency, a small but cozy apartment in the Pearl District. It had all seemed so solid, so permanent, until the agency downsized in March, cutting her position along with 3 others, until her emergency fund evaporated faster than she'd ever imagined possible, until prayer after prayer went unanswered, leaving her feeling like she was shouting into an empty universe. The morning routine felt mechanical now. Instant coffee because she'd canceled her subscription to the good stuff. A single piece of toast with peanut butter because groceries were a luxury she could no longer afford. Her laptop screen glowed with 17 rejection emails from potential employers, each one a small death to her hope. The latest one, from a startup she'd been perfect for, stung the most. "We've decided to go with someone with more senior-level experience." More senior-level experience. She was 29 years old with a portfolio that had won regional design awards. How much more experience did they want? Helen's phone buzzed with a text from her mother in Salem. "How's the job search going, sweetie? Dad and I are praying for you." The word praying made something twist in Helen's chest. Her parents had raised her in the Methodist Church, where she'd learned that God had a plan for everyone, that everything happened for a reason, that if you just had enough faith, miracles would follow. Where was her miracle now? She dressed in her last clean interview outfit, a navy blazer she'd bought when she still believed in her future. The fabric felt heavier than it used to, weighted down with the desperation she couldn't quite hide anymore. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman who looked older than her years, gray circles under brown eyes that had once sparkled with possibility. The bus ride to downtown Portland was a study in contrasts. Young professionals in expensive coats clutched their specialty coffee drinks, their faces buried in phones that probably cost more than Helen's rent. She counted the stops, each one bringing her closer to another interview she probably wouldn't get. Another chance to smile and pretend that her world wasn't crumbling. The office building on Southwest 5th Avenue stretched toward the cloudy sky like a glass monument to success she'd never achieve. Inside, the elevator carried her to the 14th floor, where Chrome Creative Agency waited behind frosted glass doors. The receptionist, a woman barely out of college with perfect skin and perfectly straight teeth, directed her to a waiting area filled with Barcelona chairs that cost more than Helen's monthly food budget. Ms. Foster? A man in his 40s emerged from a corner office, his smile as polished as his Italian leather shoes. I'm Marcus Webb, creative director. Thanks for coming in. The interview lasted exactly 23 minutes. Helen knew because she watched the clock on Marcus's desk, counting down the seconds until he would deliver the familiar rejection. He flipped through her portfolio with practiced efficiency, nodding at appropriate moments, asking questions she'd answered dozens of times before. Your work is impressive, he said finally, the word but hanging in the air like smoke. But we're really looking for someone who can hit the ground running with our pharmaceutical accounts. Someone with more healthcare marketing experience. Another specialty she didn't have. Another door closing in her face. Walking back to the bus stop, Helen felt the Portland drizzle seep through her blazer, each droplet a small reminder of her failure. A street musician played guitar near Pioneer Courthouse Square, his case open for donations. The melody was familiar, something from her childhood, but she couldn't place it. She dropped her last 2 quarters into his case, knowing she couldn't afford the gesture, but unable to stop herself. The bus ride home blurred past rain-streaked windows. Helen pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes, remembering the last time she'd felt truly hopeful about anything. It had been Easter Sunday 3 years ago, sitting in her parents' church while Pastor Williams talked about resurrection and new beginnings. She'd been between jobs then, too, but somehow it had felt different, like a pause before something better, not a free fall into nothing. Now, faith felt like a luxury she couldn't afford, like those expensive coffee drinks the other passengers sipped without thinking. Her apartment welcomed her with its familiar smell of old carpet and the lingering aroma of last night's ramen noodles. The eviction notice seemed to glow more brightly in the afternoon light streaming through her single window. 30 days to pay $3,847 in back rent, or face removal proceedings. She had exactly 4780 tau to her name, and no prospects on the horizon. Helen sat on her bed and pulled out the small leather diary she'd carried since childhood. Her grandmother had given it to her on her 7th birthday, back when she'd believed that every prayer was heard, every wish could come true if you just believed hard enough. The pages were filled with decades of hopes, dreams, fears, and pleas, to a God who seemed increasingly absent from her life. Her hands shook as she opened to a fresh page. The pen felt heavy in her fingers, loaded with all the disappointment and desperation she'd been carrying for months. Outside, the rain continued its relentless percussion against her window, and somewhere in the building, a door slammed with finality. This would be her last prayer, her final appeal to a universe that had stopped listening. Helen's prayer lay on the page like an accusation. If heaven exists, prove it. Give me a sign today. She'd thrown the diary across the room afterward, watching it hit the wall with a sound that seemed to echo through her empty apartment. Now it lay face down on the hardwood floor, its pages splayed open like broken wings. If you're still with me at this point, it means you're exactly the kind of person who understands that reality is far more mysterious than we've been taught. There's a growing community of us here who recognize that miracles don't always announce themselves with trumpet fanfare. Sometimes they whisper. Sometimes they hide in the spaces between our desperation and our surrender. Subscribe to this channel, because what happens next in Helen's story is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about divine timing. And trust me, you don't want to miss a single detail of how the universe responds when we finally stop trying to control the conversation. The days stretched ahead of her like an empty highway. Helen had 2 more interviews scheduled, both long shots that her dwindling optimism couldn't quite embrace. She retrieved the diary from the floor, its leather cover scuffed from the impact, and tucked it into her purse next to her phone, which had been unusually quiet all morning. The first interview was at a non-profit downtown, their offices crammed into the second floor of a converted warehouse. The elevator wheezed and groaned as it carried her upward, and Helen took it as an omen of how the meeting would go. She was right. The executive director, a woman with kind eyes and a perpetually exhausted expression, explained that their funding had been cut and they could only offer part-time work at $15 an hour. "I wish we could do more," she said, her voice carrying genuine regret. "Your portfolio is exactly what we need, but the board made it clear that full-time positions are off the table until next fiscal year. $15 an hour wouldn't even cover Helen's utilities, let alone rent." She thanked the woman with as much grace as she could muster and walked back into the Portland afternoon, feeling like she was dissolving one rejection at a time. The second interview was across town, requiring 2 bus transfers and a 6-block walk through a neighborhood she'd never explored. The company occupied a sleek building in the Southeast Industrial District, all exposed brick and polished concrete floors. Modern art hung on the walls, the kind of abstract pieces that either meant something profound or nothing at all. The hiring manager was younger than Helen, maybe 25, with the kind of confidence that came from never having experienced real failure. He talked about synergy and paradigm shifts, while flipping through her portfolio with barely concealed boredom. "The thing is," he said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair, "we're really looking for someone who can bring a fresh perspective to our digital strategy, someone who really gets Gen Z culture." Helen bit back the urge to point out that she was only 4 years older than him. Instead, she smiled and nodded, playing the part of the eager candidate, even though she could already see the rejection forming in his eyes. Walking to the bus stop afterward, she passed a small park where children played on swings that creaked in the afternoon breeze. A little girl with pigtails pumped her legs furiously, trying to swing higher than the boy next to her. Their laughter carried across the playground, pure and unfiltered joy that Helen barely remembered feeling. "Higher, Daddy! Push me higher!" the girl called to a man reading on a nearby bench. The word "daddy" hit Helen like a physical blow. She'd never had children, never even come close to marriage, and at 29, those possibilities felt increasingly remote. Another door that seemed to be closing, another future that required resources and stability she didn't possess. The bus was late, as Portland buses always seemed to be when you needed them most. Helen stood at the stop, watching traffic flow past in both directions, each car carrying someone who presumably had somewhere important to be. A homeless man approached, his shopping cart loaded with bottles and belongings, and asked if she had any spare change. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it more than he could know. He nodded with understanding, not judgment, and continued down the sidewalk. Something about his acceptance of her answer struck her as oddly graceful, as if he understood that everyone was carrying their own burden of lack. The ride home took 40 minutes through rush-hour traffic that crawled along the Willamette River. Helen pressed her face against the window and watched the city scroll past like scenes from someone else's life. Office buildings full of people with steady paychecks, restaurants she couldn't afford to enter, shops selling things she didn't need and couldn't buy. Her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord. "Helen, just checking in about next month's rent. Please call me when you get this." The message was polite, but firm, a reminder that her grace period was running out faster than her options. Back in her apartment, Helen stood in front of her bathroom mirror and tried to recognize the person staring back at her. When had her eyes become so hollow? When had hope been replaced by this constant background hum of anxiety that never quite went away? She splashed cold water on her face and told herself that tomorrow would be different, that somewhere in this vast city there was a job with her name on it. But the words felt empty, like prayers she'd stopped believing in. Evening settled over Portland with its usual gray embrace. Helen heated up another package of ramen noodles, the sodium-heavy broth providing comfort she couldn't find anywhere else. She ate standing at her kitchen counter, looking out at the apartment building across the street, where lights were beginning to flicker on in windows that framed other people's lives. In 4B, a family gathered around their dinner table. In 2C, a couple cuddled on their couch watching television. In 5A, an older woman watered plants on her balcony, moving with the careful attention of someone who understood that nurturing small things was its own form of prayer. Helen's own window reflected her solitary figure back at her, a woman eating noodles alone, while the world continued its evening rituals around her. She pulled the curtains closed and turned away from her reflection, unable to bear the sight of her own loneliness. The diary sat on her bedside table, closed now, holding her desperate prayer between its worn pages. Helen picked it up and ran her fingers over the leather cover, remembering the day her grandmother had given it to her. She'd been so small then, so certain that the universe was conspicuous in its love for her. Outside, the rain began to fall again, drumming against her window with insistent fingers. Helen lay down on her bed fully clothed and closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm of water against glass. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed shut with finality that seemed to echo through her bones. She had no idea that this sound, this seemingly insignificant moment, was actually the universe's way of clearing space for what was about to arrive. Helen fell asleep to the sound of rain, but woke to something else entirely. A soft humming, melodic and familiar, drifted through her apartment like a half-remembered dream. She blinked in the darkness, disoriented. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed 11:47 p.m., its red numbers casting strange shadows on her walls. The humming continued, a children's lullaby she hadn't heard in years. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, but sung in a voice so pure and sweet, it made her chest ache with recognition. Helen sat up slowly, her heart beginning to race. She lived alone on the third floor of a building with thick walls. The only sounds she ever heard were the occasional footsteps from the apartment above and the distant hum of traffic from the street below. But this was different. This was coming from inside her apartment. Helen swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor. The humming seemed to be coming from her living area, just beyond the bedroom door that she'd left slightly ajar. She reached for her phone, its screen illuminating her face in pale blue light, and considered calling 911. But what would she say? That someone had broken into her apartment to sing lullabies? The melody stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt solid. Helen held her breath, straining to hear any other sound that might explain what she'd just experienced. A car passed on the street below. The building's old pipes groaned somewhere in the walls, but nothing else. She stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her, and moved toward the bedroom door. The living room beyond was dark except for the faint orange glow of streetlights filtering through her curtains. Everything appeared exactly as she'd left it. The dining table with its single chair, the small couch facing her tiny television, the kitchen counter with her empty ramen bowl still sitting in the sink. "Hello?" she whispered, feeling foolish but unable to stop herself. "Is someone there?" Only silence answered. Helen flicked on the overhead light, squinting as the sudden brightness revealed her apartment in stark detail. Empty. Completely. Utterly empty. She walked through each room, checking the bathroom, the closet, even behind the couch. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was missing. Nothing suggested that anyone had been there at all. But she had heard that humming. She was certain of it. She returned to her bedroom and sat heavily on the edge of her bed, wondering if stress and financial worry had finally pushed her over some invisible edge into hallucination. Maybe this was what a nervous breakdown felt like. Maybe all those unanswered prayers had finally driven her to imagine divine interventions that didn't exist. The diary lay on her nightstand where she'd left it, and Helen picked it up with trembling hands. Her desperate plea from earlier stared back at her. "If heaven exists, prove it. Give me a sign today." She laughed bitterly. The auditory hallucination was hardly the miracle she'd been hoping for. She closed the diary and was about to set it aside when she noticed something strange. The pages felt different under her fingers, thicker somehow, as if someone had added new content. Helen opened it again, flipping through to find the source of the change. There, on the page immediately following her prayer, was writing she didn't recognize. Not her handwriting, but something else entirely. Large, careful letters formed words in purple crayon, the kind of penmanship she remembered from elementary school. "Don't cry anymore. I'm coming to see you soon. Love, little Helen." Helen's hands began to shake so violently she almost dropped the diary. The message was impossible, completely impossible. But there it was in purple crayon against the cream-colored paper. She ran her fingers over the letters, feeling the slight indentation where the crayon had pressed into the page. It was real, physical, undeniable. Her phone showed 11:52 p.m. She had been asleep for barely an hour, and someone had somehow entered her locked apartment, written a message in her diary in what appeared to be a child's handwriting, and then vanished without leaving any other trace of their presence. Helen stood up abruptly and walked to her front door, checking the deadbolt and chain lock. Both were securely fastened, exactly as she'd left them. The windows were locked too, and even if they hadn't been, she was 3 floors up with no fire escape on this side of the building. She returned to the diary, reading the message again and again, searching for some rational explanation. Could she have written it herself in some kind of fugue state? But the handwriting was completely different from her own, and she didn't own any purple crayons. Could someone have broken in while she was out and planted the message, then waited for her to discover it? But why? And how had they known she would write in the diary today? The questions multiplied faster than answers, creating a maze of impossibility that her rational mind couldn't navigate. Helen sat back down on her bed and stared at the message until the letters began to blur together. "Don't cry anymore. I'm coming to see you soon." Despite the impossibility of it all, something about the message felt deeply familiar, like a half-remembered conversation or a dream that lingered at the edges of consciousness. The handwriting reminded her of something too, though she couldn't quite place what. Helen walked to her closet and pulled out a shoebox she kept on the top shelf, filled with childhood memorabilia her mother had given her when she moved out. Photo albums, report cards, school projects, and birthday cards from relatives she barely remembered. At the bottom of the box was a stack of papers held together with a rubber band, stories and letters she'd written as a child. With growing excitement and terror, Helen spread the papers on her bed and began comparing the handwriting. A story about a magic pony, written in 2nd grade. A letter to Santa from when she was 7. A poem about her cat that had died when she was 8. The handwriting was identical. Not similar, not close. Identical. The same careful formation of letters, the same slight backward slant, the same way the E's looked like sideways mountains. The message in her diary had been written in her own 7-year-old handwriting, using purple crayon that she distinctly remembered being her favorite color at that age. Helen sank onto her bed, surrounded by evidence of an impossibility that her mind refused to accept. The papers from her childhood rustled as she moved, creating a soft symphony of memory and confusion. Outside, Portland continued its nightly routine, unaware that inside apartment 3B, the laws of reality had just bent themselves into an entirely new shape. She looked at the diary again, at the message that couldn't exist but did. "I'm coming to see you soon." The words seemed to pulse with their own energy, a promise that defied everything she thought she knew about time, space, and the nature of existence itself. Helen had asked for a sign from heaven. Instead, it seemed that heaven had decided to send her a messenger who shared her face, her memories, and her handwriting from 22 years ago. Helen couldn't sleep. She sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by childhood papers and the impossible diary, staring at the purple crayon message until her eyes burned. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this had to be some kind of breakdown, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by months of failure and desperation. But the evidence was undeniable, physical, real. At 3:17 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your bedroom door." Helen's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She stared at the message, reading it again and again. The number showed only as a string of zeros, which her phone's operating system shouldn't even have been able to display. She screenshot the message immediately, but when she looked at the image, it showed only a blank conversation thread. Against every instinct screaming at her to stay put, Helen stood up and walked toward her bedroom door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle, half expecting to find it locked or somehow changed. But it turned normally, opening onto her darkened living room just as it had hours earlier. Except now, soft golden light spilled from beneath the bathroom door. Helen's breath caught in her throat. She never left lights on, couldn't afford to waste electricity, and that particular glow was wrong somehow, too warm and flickering, like candlelight rather than the harsh LED bulb she'd installed to save money. "Hello?" she whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible even to herself. "I told you I was coming to see you," came the reply, and Helen's heart stopped completely. The voice was her own, but higher, smaller, filled with the absolute certainty that only children possess. It came from the direction of the bathroom, accompanied by the soft sound of humming that same lullaby she'd heard earlier. Helen's legs moved without conscious direction, carrying her across the living room toward that impossible light. Each step felt like walking through water, reality becoming increasingly fluid around her. The bathroom door stood slightly ajar, golden light pouring through the gap like liquid sunshine. She pushed the door open with one finger and stepped into a scene that couldn't exist. The bathroom had transformed completely. Gone were the chipped tiles and outdated fixtures, replaced by a space that looked exactly like the bathroom in her childhood home in Salem. Pink and white checkered wallpaper, a clawfoot tub with vintage brass fixtures, even the small wooden stool she'd used to reach the sink when she was little. But it was the mirror that made Helen's knees buckle. A 7-year-old girl sat on the edge of the bathtub, swinging her legs and humming softly. She wore a yellow sundress with tiny white flowers, the exact dress Helen remembered from her favorite childhood photograph. Her hair was pulled back in 2 perfect pigtails, tied with matching yellow ribbons, and when she looked up, Helen found herself staring into her own brown eyes, bright with innocence and unshakable faith. "You look so sad," the child said, tilting her head with the earnest concern that children reserve for wounded animals and broken toys. "I don't like seeing you sad." Helen opened her mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. The child in front of her was impossible, but she was also undeniably real. She cast a shadow on the wall behind her. Her breath fogged the mirror slightly, and when she moved, Helen could hear the soft rustle of her dress and the squeak of her patent leather shoes against the bathtub's porcelain edge. "I'm not real," Helen finally managed to whisper. The little girl giggled, a sound like silver bells in a gentle breeze. "Of course you're real, silly. I'm you and you're me. We're the same person, just at different times. Don't you remember being 7? "I remember," Helen said slowly, her voice growing stronger. "But that was 22 years ago. You can't be here. This is impossible." "Impossible is just another word for miracle," the child said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that Helen had forgotten she'd once possessed. "You used to know that. You used to believe that anything could happen if you just trusted enough." Helen sank down onto the pink bathrobe that had somehow appeared on the floor, bringing herself to eye level with her younger self. Up close, she could see every detail. The small scar on the child's chin from falling off her bicycle when she was 6. The gap between her front teeth that wouldn't close until she got braces at 13. Even the faint smell of strawberry shampoo that their mother had used to wash her hair. "Why are you here?" Helen asked. "Because you called me," the child said simply. "You wrote in the diary that you wanted a sign from heaven, but you were looking up when the answer was always inside." She reached out and touched Helen's face with small, warm fingers. "You used to pray every night, remember? You used to believe that God heard every word, that miracles happened to people who needed them most." Helen closed her eyes as memories flooded back. Kneeling beside her bed in footy pajamas, hands folded in perfect prayer position, asking God to help her grandmother's arthritis and to make sure her hamster lived forever, and to help all the children in the world have enough food to eat. Prayers so pure and selfless they made her adult heart ache with their beauty. "I stopped believing," Helen whispered. "Life got hard, and the prayers stopped getting answered." "They never stopped getting answered," the child said gently. "You stopped seeing the answers because you started looking for them in the wrong places. Remember when you were 8, and you prayed that Tommy Martinez would stop pulling your hair?" Helen opened her eyes, surprised by the specificity of the memory. "He moved away that summer. And when you were 9 and you prayed that Mom and Dad would stop fighting about money, Dad got promoted at work." The memory came flooding back, clear as daylight. "And when you were 10 and you prayed for a best friend because you were lonely at your new school, Sarah Chen moved in next door a week later." Helen's voice was barely a whisper now. The little girl nodded sagely. "Every prayer was answered, Helen. Every single one. But grown-up you decided those were coincidences because you forgot how to recognize miracles when they wore ordinary clothes." Helen felt tears streaming down her face, each drop carrying years of accumulated doubt and disappointment. "But what about now? I've been praying for months about work, about money, about not losing my apartment. Where's the miracle in that?" "You're looking at her," the child said, spreading her arms wide. "I'm your miracle, Helen. I'm here to remind you who you really are underneath all the fear and worry." You're still me, just taller and more scared. But the part that believes in magic, the part that knows miracles are real, she's still in there. The bathroom began to shimmer around them, the golden light growing brighter and more diffuse. Helen could feel something shifting inside her chest, a warmth she hadn't experienced in years, beginning to spread through her body like sunlight after a long winter. I don't know how to believe like that anymore, Helen said desperately, reaching out to touch her younger self before she could disappear. Yes, you do, the child said, taking Helen's hands in her small ones. Close your eyes and remember what it felt like to know, absolutely know, that you were loved beyond measure. Remember what it felt like to trust that everything would work out exactly as it was supposed to. Helen closed her eyes and felt 7 years old again, sitting in church between her parents on Easter Sunday, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows and painting rainbow patterns on her white dress. She remembered the absolute certainty that had filled her small heart, the knowledge that she was part of something beautiful and vast and infinitely loving. When she opened her eyes, the bathroom was beginning to fade back to its original form, but her younger self remained solid and real on the edge of the tub. The miracle isn't what happens to you, the little girl said softly. The miracle is remembering who you are when it does. Helen woke to sunlight streaming through her curtains, the first genuine Portland sunshine she'd seen in weeks. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any sudden motion might shatter the profound peace that had settled into her bones while she slept. The bathroom door stood open, revealing nothing more miraculous than chipped tiles and the outdated fixtures she'd grown accustomed to. But the sense of presence lingered, warm and comforting, like the afterglow of the most beautiful dream she'd ever experienced, except it hadn't been a dream. Helen sat up slowly and reached for the diary on her nightstand. There, on the page, following her desperate prayer, were 2 messages now. The first, in purple crayon, "Don't cry anymore. I'm coming to see you soon. Love, little Helen." But beneath it, in different colored crayon, the deep blue she'd favored when she was 8, new words had appeared. "Thank you for remembering me. I never left. Love, you." Helen's hand shook as she traced the letters with her finger. The crayon felt fresh, waxy under her touch, and she could smell the faint, sweet scent she associated with childhood art projects and endless creativity. But it was what she found on the next page that made her heart stop completely. A drawing, detailed and sophisticated beyond what any 7-year-old should have been able to create, but undeniably rendered in crayon with the earnest imperfection of a child's hand. It showed Helen as she was now, sitting at a desk in what appeared to be a bright, modern office. Sunlight poured through large windows, and other people worked happily in the background. At the bottom of the page, in that same careful child's handwriting, were the words, "Your new job. It starts Monday. Love and miracles, little you." Helen stared at the drawing until her eyes blurred with tears. It was impossible. Completely impossible. But something deep in her chest, the part of her that had spent the night remembering what faith felt like, knew with absolute certainty that it was also true. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. Helen answered without hesitation, her voice strong and clear for the first time in months. "Helen Foster." The voice belonged to a woman, professional but warm. "This is Jennifer Walsh from Cascade Creative. I know this is unusual, but I got your portfolio from Chrome Creative. Marcus Webb passed it along after your interview yesterday. He said you were exactly what we've been looking for." Helen's breath caught. Marcus Webb, who had rejected her for lack of healthcare marketing experience, had recommended her to another agency. "I'd like to offer you a position as our senior graphic designer," Jennifer continued. "Full-time, full benefits, starting salary of $75,000. We focus primarily on wellness and healthcare communication, and your portfolio shows exactly the kind of fresh perspective we need. Could you start Monday?" Helen looked down at the impossible drawing in her diary, at the office space rendered in crayon that matched perfectly with Jennifer's description of Cascade Creative. "Yes," she heard herself say, her voice filled with wonder and absolute certainty. "I can start Monday." After the call ended, Helen sat in stunned silence, holding the diary against her chest. The pragmatic part of her mind tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe Marcus had felt guilty about the rejection. Maybe Jennifer had been looking for someone for weeks, and Helen's timing was just coincidental. But the part of her that had spent the night talking to her 7-year-old self knew better. This was the answer to her prayer, delivered not from heaven above, but from the faith she'd carried inside all along. Helen walked to her kitchen and made coffee, real coffee. The good kind she'd been denying herself for months. As the rich aroma filled her apartment, she opened her laptop and began typing an email to her landlord, explaining that she'd be able to pay the back rent within the week. Then she called her parents in Salem, hearing her mother cry with relief and joy when she shared the news about the job. "I knew our prayers would be answered," her mother said through happy tears. "I never stopped believing." "Neither did I," Helen replied, and realized with perfect clarity that it was true. She'd never stopped believing. She'd just forgotten how to listen. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of phone calls and preparations. Helen arranged to meet Jennifer Walsh on Friday to fill out paperwork and tour the office, called her old colleagues to share the good news, and began planning how she would organize her new life around this unexpected miracle. But it was late that afternoon, as golden light slanted through her windows, that Helen experienced the final piece of her transformation. She was sitting at her small dining table, updating her resume on her laptop, when she heard it again, that soft, sweet humming of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." This time, Helen didn't feel afraid or confused. She simply smiled and looked up to find her 7-year-old self sitting in the chair across from her, coloring in a book that hadn't been there moments before. "Are you happy now?" the child asked, looking up from her artwork with those bright, trusting eyes. "Yes," Helen said, and meant it completely. "I'm happy, and I'm grateful, and I'm sorry it took me so long to remember." "It's okay," the little girl said with the easy forgiveness that children possess in abundance. "Growing up makes people forget sometimes, but the important thing is that you remembered when it mattered most." "Will I see you again?" Helen asked. "You'll see me every time you look in the mirror and choose faith over fear," the child replied. "Every time you pray with your whole heart instead of just your head. Every time you trust that miracles are real, even when they don't look the way you expected." The little girl stood up and walked around the table to Helen, reaching up to wrap her small arms around her older self's neck. Helen closed her eyes and hugged her back, feeling 22 years of pain and disappointment begin to heal in the embrace of her own forgotten innocence. When she opened her eyes, the child was gone, but the coloring book remained on the table. Helen picked it up with trembling hands and opened to the page her younger self had been working on. It was a picture of 2 hands reaching toward each other, one large, one small, both drawn with careful attention and colored in shades of gold and light. At the bottom of the page, in purple crayon, were the words that would stay with Helen for the rest of her life. "Heaven never forgot you. You just forgot how to see." Helen closed the coloring book and walked to her bedroom window, looking out at the Portland skyline as it prepared for another evening. The city looked exactly the same as it had 24 hours ago, but everything had changed. She had changed, not because her circumstances were different, but because she had remembered who she was beneath all the fear and worry. She was the same little girl who had knelt beside her bed in footy pajamas, believing with absolute certainty that she was loved beyond measure. She was the same person who had trusted that miracles were real, that prayers were answered, that everything would work out exactly as it was supposed to. She had never stopped being that person. She had simply forgotten how to see her with grown-up eyes. Helen picked up her diary one final time and turned to a fresh page. Her handwriting was steady now, filled with confidence and gratitude she hadn't felt in years. "Thank you for the reminder that miracles aren't fairy tales. They're love letters from a universe that never stops believing in us, even when we stop believing in ourselves. Thank you for showing me that sometimes the answer to our prayers isn't what we think we need, but who we've always been. And thank you for proving that heaven isn't a place we go to. It's a home we carry inside us, waiting patiently for us to remember the way back." Outside her window, Portland settled into evening with its usual grace, and somewhere in the building, someone was humming a lullaby that sounded like pure joy set to music. 6 months later, Helen Foster stood in her new office at Cascade Creative, watching the morning light paint golden patterns across her desk. The space looked exactly like the crayon drawing her 7-year-old self had left in her diary. The same large windows, the same collaborative atmosphere, even the same sense of purpose and joy that radiated from every corner. The impossible had become beautifully, wonderfully ordinary. Her work at the wellness agency fulfilled her in ways she hadn't expected. Every campaign she designed helped people find hope in their darkest moments. Every brochure she created carried the potential to transform someone's understanding of what healing looked like. It was as if her own miracle had prepared her to help others recognize theirs. The diary sat in her desk drawer now, filled with new entries written in her adult handwriting, but infused with the wonder she'd reclaimed that impossible night. She no longer wrote desperate pleas to an absent God. Instead, she wrote thank you notes to a universe that had never stopped conspiring in her favor, even when she'd forgotten how to see its gifts. Helen's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "How's my miracle worker today?" It had become their daily check-in, a ritual that acknowledged not just Helen's transformation, but her parents' renewed faith in the power of prayer, answered in unexpected ways. "Living the impossible and loving every minute of it," Helen typed back, smiling as she remembered how foreign those words would have felt just months before. During her lunch break, Helen walked to the small park near her office, where children played on swings while their parents watched from nearby benches. She'd made this walk dozens of times since starting her job, drawn by something she couldn't quite name but didn't question. Today, a little girl with pigtails sat alone on a swing, moving slowly back and forth, while tears streamed down her cheeks. Helen approached carefully, recognizing the particular kind of sadness that comes from feeling forgotten by the world. "Are you okay, sweetie?" Helen asked gently, kneeling beside the swing. The child looked up with brown eyes that reminded Helen of her own at that age. "My mommy says we have to move because she lost her job," the girl said in a voice thick with confusion and fear. "I don't want to leave my friends." Helen felt her heart expand with familiar warmth. "That sounds really scary," she said, her voice carrying the same gentle authority she remembered from her own childhood encounter. "But sometimes when things change, it's because something even better is getting ready to happen. Sometimes what looks like an ending is really just a new beginning in disguise." The little girl wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "How do you know?" "Because the same thing happened to me once," Helen said, settling beside the swing. "I thought my whole world was falling apart, and I couldn't see any way it would get better. But then something impossible happened that reminded me who I really was underneath all the scared feelings." "What happened?" the child asked, her tears slowing as curiosity took over. Helen smiled, remembering another little girl who had asked questions with the same earnest need for hope. "I met someone who helped me remember that miracles are real, even when they don't look the way we expect them to. And you know what? I think you're going to have your own miracle story to tell someday." The child's face brightened slightly. "Really, really," Helen said with absolute certainty. "The universe has a way of taking care of people who need it most, especially brave little girls who aren't afraid to feel their feelings all the way through." As Helen walked back to her office, she felt the presence she'd grown accustomed to over the past months, a warm, gentle awareness that felt like being watched over by the most loving version of herself. She no longer questioned whether her encounter had been real or imagined. The fruit it had borne in her life was evidence enough. That evening, Helen sat in her apartment, the same space that had once felt like a prison, but now radiated with contentment and possibility. She opened her diary to a fresh page and began to write, her words flowing with the easy grace of someone who had learned to trust the process of becoming. "Today, I met a little girl who reminded me why this all happened," she wrote. "Not just for me, but for everyone whose prayers seem to disappear into silence. The miracle isn't that heaven hears us. It's that heaven trusts us enough to let us find our own way back home. And sometimes, when we've forgotten the path completely, it sends us the most perfect guide, ourselves, before we learned that miracles were supposed to be impossible." Helen closed the diary and walked to her window, looking out at Portland's evening lights twinkling like earthbound stars. Somewhere in the city, other people were writing their own desperate prayers, feeling abandoned by a universe that seemed to have forgotten their names. But Helen knew now what she hadn't known 6 months ago. The universe never forgets. It just waits, with infinite patience and perfect love, for us to remember who we were before we learned to doubt our own magic. The answer had always been inside, written in the handwriting of every version of herself she'd ever been, waiting for the moment when she was ready to come home. Helen's story reminds us that miracles aren't violations of natural law. They're love letters written in a language we forgot how to read. When we feel most abandoned by heaven, We're actually being invited to rediscover the divine spark that has never left us, even when life convinced us it was gone. Your younger self is still with you, carrying every dream you've forgotten and every prayer you thought went unanswered. That child who believed in magic before the world taught them to doubt, who trusted in love before fear became familiar, who knew with absolute certainty that they were cherished beyond measure. They're not lost. They're waiting. Maybe your miracle won't look like Helen's. Maybe it won't involve mysterious diary entries or impossible encounters. But it will be perfect for you, arriving exactly when you need it most, wearing whatever disguise your heart needs to recognize it as the answer you've been seeking. The universe hasn't forgotten your name. It hasn't stopped listening to your prayers. It hasn't given up on your dreams. It's simply waiting for you to remember that the greatest miracle of all isn't what happens to you. It's who you discover you've always been when you finally come home to yourself. Your 7-year-old self is calling your name. Can you hear them?